The room was dimly lit, the fire casting restless shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit searching for its way home. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that settles over a gathering when dark secrets are about to be unearthed. And then, in that silence, Dr. Pender spoke. "You may not believe me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years, "but I have seen a man die. Not by any human hand, nor by any weapon known to us. I watched him fall, his face frozen in terror, his body collapsing as though the very air around him had turned against him." A hush fell over the room. Someone shifted uneasily in their chair. The crackling fire was the only sound, a sinister accompaniment to the clergyman's words. "Go on," Joyce Lempriere urged, leaning forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Pender nodded, his eyes clouding with the ghosts of the past. "My life has been one of quiet places and steady routine. I have never been a man of adventure, nor have I sought out the strange or the unexplainable. Yet, just once, I stepped into a world where reality blurred, and the impossible became terrifyingly real. It was many years ago, but even now, with a mere flicker of memory, I can feel the icy grip of that night, the overwhelming sensation that something unseen, something malevolent, was watching, waiting." Sir Henry shifted in his seat. "You're giving me chills, Pender." "As well you should be chilled," the old clergyman replied gravely, "because that night changed everything I thought I knew about this world." The room held its breath. No one spoke. Dr. Pender leaned back, taking off his pince-nez. His voice dropped to a whisper, forcing his listeners to lean in. "It all began with a house," he continued. "Silent Grove, a beautiful but cursed property on the borders of Dartmoor. A place that had stood empty for years, changing hands from one unfortunate owner to the next, leaving behind only stories of loss, tragedy, and despair." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "There are places like that, houses that breathe in sorrow and exhale misfortune." "A foolish superstition," Mr. Petherick scoffed. "People bring their own troubles upon themselves." "Perhaps," Pender murmured, "and yet one cannot deny the pattern." He took a deep breath before continuing. "The house had recently been purchased by an old friend of mine, Sir Richard Hayden. He had invited me for a weekend gathering, along with a curious assortment of guests. His cousin, Elliot Hayden, a certain Lady Mannering and her pale, unassuming daughter, Violet, Captain Rogers and his wife, who cared for nothing but horses and the thrill of the hunt, a young Dr. Simmons, and then—" He hesitated for a moment. "And then there was Miss Diana Ashley." Something about the way he said her name sent a ripple through the group. A name with power, a name that held secrets. "She was a woman one did not easily forget," he admitted. "Tall, dark, and exquisite in a way that made heads turn and hearts falter. Her skin had the smoothness of untouched ivory, her slanted dark eyes carried a knowing glint, and her voice, was like the chime of a deep, resonant bell, one that echoed long after the words had faded." Sir Henry let out a low whistle. "Sounds like a woman who knew her effect on men." "Indeed," Pender said, and it was clear that Richard Hayden had arranged the entire gathering as a stage for her, hoping to weave himself into the story of her life. He was utterly captivated, helpless in the spell she cast. But Diana Ashley, she was unpredictable. One day, she lavished Richard with attention, making him feel as if he were the only man in the world. The next, she would turn her gaze elsewhere, leaving him restless, tormented, desperate. The clergyman's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of his chair. "I believe," he said slowly, "that it was this dangerous game, that set into motion a tragedy none of us could have foreseen." A log in the fire shifted with a loud crack, making someone startle. But no one spoke, no one interrupted. Everyone was waiting for the horror to begin. The Grove of Astarte. The morning after my arrival, Richard Hayden led us on a tour of the estate. His excitement was evident, his voice animated as he spoke of the land and its history. Yet, even then, there was something in his manner, something just beneath the surface that unsettled me. A restless energy, as if he were on the cusp of some great revelation or disaster. The house itself was sturdy, unremarkable, a solid Devonshire structure of time-worn granite, built not for beauty but for endurance. It stood against the elements like an immovable sentinel, its thick walls a testament to centuries of withstanding wind and storm. The windows framed a vast, almost endless view of Dartmoor, rolling hills that stretched into the horizon, their peaks crowned with weather-beaten tors. There was a strange, ancient beauty in that desolate, expansive beauty that carried with it the weight of forgotten time. Beyond the house, the land was scattered with relics of past civilizations, whispers of those who had lived and died long before us. The slopes of the nearest tor bore the unmistakable outlines of Neolithic hut circles, ghostly imprints of an age lost to history. Further off, a burial barrow had been recently unearthed, yielding bronze artifacts and fragments of an era so distant that even its echoes had faded. Hayden, ever the antiquarian, spoke with feverish enthusiasm. "This land," he said, gesturing grandly, "has been touched by so many hands. Neolithic wanderers, Druids, Romans, even the early Phoenicians. Their presence lingers, if one knows where to look." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But this is the most interesting place of all." We followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the rugged, untamed moorland, but then my eyes settled on it. A grove of trees, dense, unnaturally dense. Unlike the rest of the wind-scoured land, this place seemed untouched by time, as though the trees had rooted themselves centuries ago and refused to surrender to the elements. They stood unnervingly close together, their dark branches intertwined like fingers clutching at the sky. "That," Hayden said, "is Silent Grove." A curious hush settled over our group. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against us with an almost physical weight. It was difficult to explain, but I felt an inexplicable reluctance to move closer. Hayden smiled a knowing, almost taunting smile. "Come," he said, "let's step inside." I did not want to, and yet I followed. The moment we crossed the threshold into the grove, the atmosphere changed. The air was heavy, stagnant, as if we had passed into another world entirely. The outside sounds, the moorland winds, the distant calls of birds vanished, swallowed by an unnatural silence. It was a silence that felt alive. I glanced around. The trees, gnarled and ancient, loomed over us like silent sentinels. Their trunks bore deep scars, strange carvings that time had not fully erased. No birds nested in the branches. No rustling disturbed the stillness. A shiver crawled down my spine. "I don't like this place," I murmured. Hayden turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Ah," he said softly. "You feel it, don't you? The weight of history, the echo of what once was." He gestured to the ground beneath our feet. "This," he said, "is no ordinary grove. This is a relic of the past, preserved through centuries. A sacred place, but not one of your faith, Pender." I frowned. "What do you mean?" His eyes gleamed. "This," he said, "is a grove of Astarte." Astarte. The name sent an involuntary chill through me. I had read of Haran, ancient goddess, worshipped in civilizations long gone. To some, she was a deity of love and fertility. To others, she was something far darker. "There is only one other known grove of Astarte in this country," Hayden continued, his voice lowering. "Up north, near the Roman wall. But here, I believe, we have another. An untouched sanctuary of the past, where rites were once performed under these very trees." "Rites?" Diana Ashley spoke for the first time, her voice soft, almost hypnotic. She was gazing around the grove with a peculiar expression, her dark eyes shimmering with something I couldn't quite place. "What kind of rites, I wonder?" Hayden hesitated. "Not reputable ones," he admitted finally. A slight smile played on Diana's lips. "Ah," she murmured. "The best kind, then." A flicker of something passed across Hayden's face, something almost like admiration. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence pressed against us, heavy and suffocating. I had the overwhelming sense that we were trespassers, that something unseen was watching. I turned sharply, expecting what? A figure among the trees, a shifting of shadows. There was nothing. And yet, I knew we were not alone. Hayden's voice broke the spell. "Come," he said abruptly. "We should go back." We turned, making our way out of the grove. As soon as we stepped beyond its borders, the world seemed to breathe again. The wind stirred. A bird called out. The unnatural hush lifted. I exhaled, only then realizing I had been holding my breath. Diana Ashley lingered for a moment at the edge of the grove, her fingers brushing against the bark of a tree. Then, with a slow, deliberate step, she rejoined us. "Fascinating place," she murmured. And though her tone was casual, there was something in her expression, some quiet, knowing satisfaction that left me deeply uneasy. "The idle house of Astarte, by all accounts," said Captain Rogers with a loud, hollow laugh, the kind that held no real mirth. "Rather hot stuff, I imagine." His words hung in the air, jarring against the silence of the grove. Hayden ignored him completely, his attention fixed on something ahead. His eyes gleamed with an intensity I did not like. "In the center of the grove there should be a temple," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. Then, with the air of a man indulging a private amusement, he turned to us. "I can't quite run to temples, but I have allowed myself a small fancy." We had, at that moment, stepped into a clearing. The trees, thick and oppressive, suddenly gave way to an open space bathed in dappled sunlight. At the heart of this space stood a peculiar structure's mall, unassuming yet somehow foreboding. It was made of stone, its surface worn with time. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a summer house. But there was something about it, something that made the hairs at the back of my neck rise. Diana Ashley, ever curious, tilted her head and studied Hayden. "And what do you call this little folly of yours?" she asked. A slow smile played across his lips. "I call it the idle house," he said. "The idle house of Astarte." A stillness settled over the group. Unconsciously, we drew closer, as if compelled by some unseen force. Hayden stepped forward, leading the way inside. Within, the air was cool, heavy with the scent of age and stone. In the center of the small chamber, on a crude ebony pillar, rested a strange idol. It was a small carved figure of a woman, her body rigid and austere, her head adorned with crescent horns. Beneath her, a lion crouched in submission, its features eroded with time. "Astarte of the Phoenicians," Hayden declared with reverence, "the goddess of the moon." Diana Ashley let out a delighted gasp. She stepped closer, her dark eyes alight with something I could not quite name. "The goddess of the moon," she repeated, almost in a whisper. Then, suddenly, she clapped her hands together, her voice rising with childlike enthusiasm. "Oh, we must do something special tonight. A wild, moonlit revel. A fancy dress party. We'll come out here and celebrate the rites of Astarte." Something inside me twisted. I did not know why, but I felt an almost visceral repulsion at her words. Without thinking, I moved sharply, a reflexive rejection of the idea. Elliot Hayden, Richard's cousin, turned to me, watching me closely. "You don't like this, do you, Padre?" he asked. His tone was gentle, but there was an odd note in it, something between curiosity and concern. I met his gaze steadily. "No," I said gravely, "I do not." Elliot hesitated. Then he laughed, though it was a nervous sound. "But it's only tomfoolery," he said. "Dick can't seriously believe this is a true sacred grove. It's just a fancy of his, a bit of theatricality." He shrugged. "And even if it were real?" "If it were," I prompted. He hesitated again. "Well," he said finally, "you don't believe in that sort of thing, do you? You, a parson?" I held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "I am not sure that as a parson I ought not to believe in it." He shifted uneasily. "But that kind of thing," he gestured vaguely, "it's all finished. Done with." I sighed. "I am not so sure," I said quietly. "I only know this. I am not, by nature, a man who is sensitive to atmosphere. But ever since I entered this grove, I have felt a distinct impression of something ancient, something malevolent, a presence, an unseen menace all around us." A shadow passed over Elliot's face. He glanced over his shoulder, as if suddenly aware of the silence pressing in upon us. "Yes," he admitted, "it is queer. I know what you mean, but perhaps it's only our imagination playing tricks. What do you say, Simons?" Dr. Simmons had been standing quietly to one side, his arms crossed, his brows furrowed in thought. At Elliot's question, he remained silent for a long moment before finally saying, in a low voice, "I don't like it. I can't tell you why, but I don't like it." His words sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. At that moment, Violet Mannering, pale and visibly agitated, crossed over to me. She gripped my arm, her fingers trembling. "I hate this place," she whispered fiercely. "I hate it. Please, let's leave." I nodded. "Yes," I said, "let's go." One by one, the others followed, as if shaking off some invisible spell. The moment we stepped beyond the boundary of the grove, it was as if a weight had lifted. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air easier to breathe. Only Diana Ashley remained behind. I turned, looking back. She stood at the threshold of the idol house, her gaze fixed on the idol. The sunlight caught in her dark hair, turning it to gold, but there was something unnatural about the way she stood motionless, transfixed. Something about the way she looked at that small ancient figure filled me with a sense of dread I could not explain. A moment later, she turned and rejoined us. The day was unseasonably hot, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The moor lay basking in golden light, its vast expanse stretching endlessly in all directions. And yet, even as we walked away, I could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that some unseen force had awakened. That night, as the idea of Diana's moonlit revel took hold, there was laughter and whispers, excitement and careless amusement. But beneath it all, I felt it still. A presence, watching, waiting. And I knew with an unshakable certainty that the Grove of Astarte had not yet finished with us. A night of mystery and terror. The anticipation in the air crackled like unseen electricity as we all emerged from our rooms in our chosen costumes. Laughter rang through the house as we admired each other's outfits. Captain Rogers and his wife, swathed in rough, primitive fabrics, proclaimed themselves Neolithic hut dwellers, their cave-like aesthetic achieved at the expense of the house's hearthrugs. Richard Hayden had taken on the role of a Phoenician sailor, a nod to his fascination with ancient civilizations, while his cousin had donned the fierce garb of a brigand chief. Dr. Simmons, ever the pragmatist, had transformed into a chef, complete with a towering white hat. Lady Mannering was a hospital nurse, her crisp white uniform standing out among the more extravagant ensembles, while her daughter Violet was draped in gauzy silks as a Circassian slave. I myself had chosen to become a monk, a decision I soon regretted, for the heavy robes clung to me uncomfortably in the warm summer air. Diana Ashley, however, was the last to appear, her entrance eagerly awaited by all. We had expected something dazzling, dramatic perhaps, a shimmering goddess or a bejeweled queen. Instead, she descended the staircase wrapped in a loose black domino, its folds obscuring her figure entirely. "The unknown," she declared airily. "That is what I am tonight." There was a ripple of laughter, a few murmurs of disappointment, but Diana merely smiled, her eyes glinting with a secret amusement. The moonlit grove. After dinner, we drifted outside into the gardens. The night was intoxicatingly beautiful, still, and bathed in silver moonlight. The vast moors stretched around us, their undulating forms cast into deep shadows. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its mournful cry only adding to the strange, otherworldly atmosphere. Time slipped away in pleasant conversation, until someone suddenly realized that Diana Ashley was missing. "Surely she hasn't gone to bed?" Richard Hayden asked, glancing around. Violet shook her head, frowning slightly. "No, I saw her heading toward the grove about 15 minutes ago." She lifted a slender hand, pointing toward the dark cluster of trees that loomed in the moonlight. A hush fell over our group, the grove. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if an invisible hand had tightened around us, a silent warning settling into the pit of our stomachs. "What the devil is she doing there?" muttered Hayden. Some mischief, no doubt. Despite an unspoken reluctance, we moved forward as one, drawn by both curiosity and an uneasy sense of foreboding. The grove stood before us, its trees unnaturally still. Their dense canopy swallowed the moonlight, leaving only a yawning blackness beyond. As we stepped inside, a strange hush enveloped us. The air felt thicker, pressing down upon us like an invisible weight. Somewhere, hidden among the tangled branches, something whispered, a mere rustling of leaves, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. The deeper we ventured, the more the darkness seemed to breathe around us, as though the trees themselves were alive, listening. The others must have felt it too, for we instinctively drew closer together, our previous lightheartedness now replaced by unease. The idol house, and then, suddenly, we emerged into the clearing and froze. A figure stood on the threshold of the idol house, bathed in pale, unearthly light. For a moment I could not breathe. She was wrapped in shimmering gauze, her silhouette ghostly and insubstantial. Two crescent horns curved upward from the dark masses of her hair, casting eerie shadows across her face. Her eyes burned with an intensity that made my blood turn cold. "My God," Richard Hayden whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Sweat gleamed on his forehead. But it was Violet who spoke next, her voice sharp with recognition. "It's Diana," she exclaimed. But she looked so different. Indeed she did. There was something transformed about her, something inhuman. The Diana Ashley we knew had always been vibrant, flirtatious, brimming with laughter. But this woman, this creature, was something else entirely. She raised her arms slowly, deliberately, her movements hypnotic. When she spoke, her voice rang clear and sweet, yet carried with it an unmistakable sense of power. "I am the priestess of Astarte," she intoned, the words hanging in the air like an incantation. "Beware how you approach me, for I hold death in my hand." A chill settled over us. The night itself seemed to pulse with something ancient, something beyond our understanding. Lady Mannering took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Diana, dear, don't." But before she could say another word, the ground beneath us seemed to shift, as though something unseen had awakened. And then, a scream, loud, terrified, and abruptly cut off. The curse of the idol house. A thick silence stretched over the clearing, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The pale moonlight bathed Diana Ashley in an otherworldly glow, her gauzy garments shimmering like a spectral presence. "You give us the creeps, you really do," muttered Lady Mannering, shivering despite the warm night air. Richard Hayden took a step forward, his breath catching. "My God, Diana," he cried, "you are magnificent." Now that my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, I could see her more clearly, and I realized, with an odd lurch of unease, that something was different about her, something chilling. Her features had sharpened, her cheekbones more pronounced, her lips curved in a knowing, secretive smile that did not belong to the Diana we knew. Her eyes, once filled with laughter and warmth, had become slits of dark, glinting cruelty, holding a depth of knowledge that seemed ancient, inhuman. She lifted a slender hand, her voice carrying an eerie authority. "Beware," she intoned. "Do not approach the goddess. If anyone lays a hand on me, it is death." A shiver ran through the group, but Richard only laughed, shaking his head. "Diana, you're playing the part a little too well," he said. "Come on now. Stop it. Somehow or other, I don't like it." But even as he spoke, he was moving towards her, drawn in as if by an invisible force. Diana's expression darkened. She flung out her hand, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Stop," she commanded. "One step closer and I will smite you with the magic of Astarte." The air seemed to thicken, as though the very night was holding its breath. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw something shimmering around her, like a wavering heat haze, something that was not quite real, but undeniably there. Richard hesitated just for a moment. Then he let out a short laugh and took another step forward. And then it happened. Without warning, he staggered. His body convulsed, his breath hitched in his throat, and before anyone could react, he crumpled, falling forward onto the grass. The sound of his collapse seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the clearing. A stunned silence followed. Then, Diana Ashley began to laugh. A wild, terrible, hysterical laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was a sound that did not belong to her, high, unnatural, laced with something that was neither amusement nor fear, but something much, much worse. Elliot Hayden was the first to react. With an oath, he sprang forward. "I can't stand this," he cried. "Get up, Dick. Get up, man." But Richard Hayden did not move. Elliot reached him in 3 strides, dropped to his knees, and rolled his cousin onto his back. The moonlight illuminated Richard's face pale, eyes half-lidded, his mouth slightly open as though he had tried to say something before. Elliot's hands trembled as he bent closer. Then, suddenly, he recoiled. He rose sharply to his feet, swaying slightly. "Doctor," he said hoarsely. "Doctor, for God's sake, come. I think he is dead." A collective gasp rippled through the group. Dr. Simmons hurried forward, his expression grim. Meanwhile, Elliot stumbled back toward us, his face pale as death, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He was staring down at his hands. At first, I didn't understand. Then I saw it. A stain. A dark, red stain on his fingers. At that moment, Diana let out a piercing scream. "I have killed him!" she shrieked. "Oh my God, I didn't mean to. But I have killed him." And with that, she collapsed, crumpling into a heap on the ground. Mrs. Rogers gave a strangled cry, clutching her husband's arm. "Oh, do let us get away from this dreadful place," she wailed. "Anything might happen to us here. Oh, it's awful, it's awful." Elliot turned to me, gripping my shoulder. His eyes burned feverishly, his voice shaking. "It can't be, man," he whispered. "I tell you it can't be. A man cannot be killed like that. It's against nature." I struggled to calm him. "There must be an explanation," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Perhaps your cousin had some unsuspected weakness of the heart. The shock, the excitement." Elliot cut me off with a violent shake of his head. "You don't understand," he said. And then, slowly, he held up his hands again, the moonlight glinting off the dark crimson smear. "Dick didn't die of shock," he said, his voice hollow. "He was stabbed to the heart." A hush fell over us. Someone whispered, "But where is the weapon?" And in the moonlit clearing, beneath the shadow of the idol house, no answer came. The idol house mystery. The night was eerily silent as Dr. Simons rose from his examination of the body. His face, usually composed and professional, was pale, his hands slightly trembling. He looked at each of us, his voice a mere whisper, yet carrying the weight of something unnatural. "Are we all mad?" he said. "What is this place where things like this can happen?" A thick, choking silence spread among us. No one spoke. No one even moved. It was as if the very air around us had thickened with something unseen, something malignant. I swallowed hard. Then, "It is true?" I asked. Dr. Simons gave a slow, hesitant nod. "The wound is deep," he said, "precise like the kind inflicted by a long, thin dagger. But," he exhaled sharply, his voice breaking, "there is no dagger." We turned, our gazes shifting from one person to another. The question hung in the air, unspoken but suffocating. How could there be a wound without a weapon? Elliot Hayden was the first to break the silence. His voice was sharp, demanding. "But it must be there. The weapon must have fallen. It has to be on the ground." Without waiting, we all dropped to our knees, searching frantically in the moonlit grass. The wind rustled through the trees, whispering through the grove like unseen voices laughing at our desperation. But the weapon, whatever had killed Richard Hayden, was nowhere to be found. Then, in a trembling voice, Violet Mannering spoke. "Diana," she said, her eyes wide with memory. Diana had something in her hand, a dagger. I saw it glinting when she raised it. We all turned to look at Diana Ashley, still lying unconscious on the cold ground, her breathing shallow. Lady Mannering hesitated, then bent down, carefully prying open Diana's fingers. She straightened and shook her head. "There is nothing in her hand now," she said, and I see nothing around her either." Elliot clenched his jaw. "That's impossible. She was holding something." Dr. Simmons stepped forward. "We must get her inside," he said gravely. "She needs rest. Rogers, will you help?" Between us, we lifted the limp form of Diana Ashley and carried her back to the house. No one spoke. No one even breathed too loudly. The weight of uncertainty pressed upon us all, a terrible, suffocating pressure. And as soon as we placed her on a sofa inside, we turned back, for there was still one more task. The body of Sir Richard Hayden. We carried him through the halls of the Granite House and placed him in his bedroom. The room, once so full of warmth and laughter, was now filled with an oppressive, ghostly silence. The butler was sent off on a bicycle 12 long miles through the night to fetch the police. As we stood there, Elliot grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, almost desperate. "I'm going back to the Grove," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "No," I said immediately. "Let it be. We have already searched." "No," he cut me off. "That weapon has to be found. You think this is supernatural. You think my cousin was killed by some invisible force." His voice shook with a mix of anger and fear. I refused to believe it. I wanted to argue, to hold him back, but there was a fire in his eye zone I knew I could not extinguish. "If you won't come with me, I'll go alone," he said. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed against setting foot in that grove again, but I could not let him go alone. "Fine," I murmured. "Let's go." The return to the grove. The wind had picked up by the time we reached the clearing, rustling through the trees with an almost whispering quality. The moon had shifted slightly, casting elongated shadows that danced unnervingly across the ground. Elliot stepped forward first, his eyes darting across the ground, searching. I lingered near the edge, unable to shake the sense of dread pressing down on me. "There's nothing here," I said. Elliot didn't respond. He was focused, scanning the area, overturning small rocks and branches. His breath came faster, frustration rising. Then he froze. I saw it too, the faintest glimmer of metal, half buried in the dirt. A dagger. It was lying just a few feet away from where Richard had fallen. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. The blade, dark, ancient-looking, was completely clean. No blood. No sign of having been used. It looked as though it had been lying there undisturbed for centuries. Elliot hesitated, then reached out. As his fingers brushed the handle, the wind surged violently through the grove, howling like a living thing. The trees shook, the leaves rattling like whispers of the dead. "Elliot, don't," I started. But he had already picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, he gasped, his body convulsing violently, his face twisted in pain, as if an unseen force had seized him. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm, yanking him back. The dagger slipped from his grip, falling back to the ground with a dull thud. Elliot stumbled, his breathing ragged, sweat beading on his forehead. "What the hell was that?" he panted. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The answer was all around us, in the wind, in the trees, in the very air that seemed to pulse with something unseen, something ancient, and something very, very angry. The police arrive. Back at the house, the atmosphere was suffocating. No one spoke as the police arrived, their skepticism clear in their expressions. They did not believe us. Not about the invisible murder weapon, not about the grove, not about the dagger that seemed untouched by time. Their focus, instead, was Diana Ashley. "We need to question Miss Ashley," the lead officer said. Dr. Simons immediately blocked their path. "She is under heavy sedation," he stated firmly. "She will not be disturbed until morning." The officer scowled but relented, for the time being. As the night dragged on, none of us could sleep. The events of the evening replayed in our minds over and over again. And despite everything, despite logic, despite reason, I could not shake the dreadful certainty settling deep in my bones. This was not over. Not by a long shot. And the idle house of Astarte was not done with us yet. The house was eerily silent, weighed down by the horrors of the night before. No one had slept properly, not truly. We had dozed, fitfully, tormented by uneasy dreams and an ever-present sense of dread. It wasn't until around 7 in the morning that someone finally thought to ask, "Where is Elliot Hayden?" Dr. Simmons, who had been tending to Diana Ashley, suddenly straightened. A shadow passed over his face. "I wish he hadn't gone back there," he muttered. It was reckless, foolhardy. A chill ran through me. The memory of Elliot disappearing into the night, determined to solve the mystery, pressed on my mind like a weight. "You don't think—" I hesitated, my mouth suddenly dry. "You don't think anything has happened to him?" Dr. Simmons did not answer immediately. His expression was grave. "I hope not," he said at last. "But Padre, I think you and I had better go and see." I swallowed hard. I knew he was right, but the mere thought of stepping foot into that cursed grove again made my stomach twist. There was something unearthly about that place, something dark and waiting. And yet, I could not refuse. Together we set out, our footsteps crunching against the damp grass as we moved toward the trees. The air was colder than it should have been for morning, the mist curling lazily around our feet. The grove loomed ahead, the trees standing unnaturally still, as though listening. "Elliot," we called. Silence. We pushed forward, past the thick trunks, into the clearing. The moment we stepped in, Simmons clutched my arm, his fingers tightening in a grip of alarm. I saw it too. The blood drained from my face. There, lying motionless on the exact same patch of ground where Richard Hayden had fallen the night before, was Elliot Hayden. "My God," Simmons breathed. "It's got him too." We ran to him, fear making our movements clumsy. Elliot's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive, barely. And this time, there was no question about what had happened. A long, thin bronze dagger, its surface dulled with age, was embedded deep into his shoulder. Unlike before, the weapon had not vanished into thin air. Simmons exhaled sharply. "Through the shoulder, not the heart," he murmured. "That's lucky." He pressed a hand against Elliot's wrist, checking his pulse. "He's weak, but he'll survive." Then he looked up at me, his face pale. On my soul, I don't know what to think. I swallowed, my eyes locked on the dagger. The very sight of it sent a shudder through me. There was something deeply wrong about it, something unnatural. "At least he's alive," I murmured. "He'll be able to tell us what happened." But that was the one thing Elliot Hayden could not do. The horror of the idol house. Hours later, when Elliot was finally able to speak, his account of the night was chilling in its vagueness. He could not remember seeing anyone attack him. He could not even remember being stabbed. He told us that after searching fruitlessly for the dagger, he had given up and decided to keep watch near the idol house. The night had been eerily still, too still. And then, slowly, he had felt it. A presence. At first, it had been a mere sensation, an uneasy feeling that he was being watched. The thought was ridiculous, but it grew stronger, creeping into his bones. No matter how hard he tried to shake it off, the feeling only intensified. Then the wind had begun to rise. But it wasn't normal wind, Elliot murmured. His voice was hoarse, his brow damp with sweat. It didn't come from the trees, it came from inside the idol house. A strange, unnatural breeze had begun to stir, cold and whispering, brushing against his skin like unseen fingers. He had turned to face the ancient stone structure, peering inside. The small, weathered statue of the goddess had stood motionless in the shadows, its carved features expressionless. And yet, "It moved," Elliot whispered. "I swear to you it moved." At first, he had dismissed it as an optical illusion, a trick of the light. But then the impossible had happened. The idol grew. It expanded, swelling in size until it loomed over him, its presence pressing down on his chest like a weight. The darkness around it pulsed. A thick, suffocating silence had filled the air. And then, pain. A sharp, blinding agony had exploded between his temples, sending him reeling. He had staggered backward, unable to think, unable to breathe. And as he fell, he had felt the cold, burning sensation of the dagger slicing into his shoulder. The mystery remains. The dagger was examined thoroughly. This time there was no question it was the same weapon that had been dug up in the ancient burial mound, the same one Richard Hayden had acquired. Where had it been kept? In the house, in the grove. No one knew. And more disturbingly, who had used it? The police, skeptical of anything beyond logic, remained convinced that Diana Ashley was somehow responsible. They argued that despite our testimony, she must have stabbed both men. But how? She had never been close enough. And how did the dagger vanish the first time? How did it reappear? No one could answer these questions. And so, the case remained an enigma, a puzzle with no solution, a mystery. As for myself, I had only one thought as I gazed out at the grove from the window of the house, the trees swaying ever so slightly in the wind. The idol house of Astarte was not just an ancient ruin. It was something more. Something old, something watching. And I feared deep in my soul that it was not yet finished with us. A curse, a killer, or madness. A heavy silence filled the room. The horror of the events weighed upon us, thick and suffocating. It was Joyce Lampriere who finally spoke, her voice low and uncertain. "There doesn't seem to be anything left to say," she murmured. "It's all so horrible, so uncanny." She turned towards Dr. Pender, her eyes searching. "Have you no explanation, doctor? Surely, you must have some theory." The old clergyman hesitated, his face thoughtful, lined with years of wisdom. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes," he said, "I have an explanation of sorts, a curious one. But even to my mind, certain aspects remain unaccounted for." He paused, as though weighing his words carefully. The crackling of the fire in the hearth was the only sound in the room. Joyce leaned forward. "I've been to seances before," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "You may scoff, but strange things can happen, things that can't be explained by logic. Hypnotism, mass suggestion. Who's to say the girl didn't truly believe herself to be a priestess of Astarte, that she wasn't somehow possessed?" She shuddered. Perhaps she did stab him. Maybe she threw the dagger that Miss Mannering saw in her hand. "Or," said Raymond West, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his chair, "it could have been a javelin." We turned to him, intrigued. He spoke slowly, working through the idea aloud. "Moonlight distorts things. Shapes become blurred. Shadows play tricks on the mind. It's possible that what Miss Mannering saw wasn't a dagger at all, but a kind of spear, longer, deadlier. Perhaps she stabbed him from a distance, and the illusion of the supernatural was only our own minds filling in the gaps." He hesitated, then added, "And if everyone expected to see him fall, as if struck by an unseen force, if we were all primed to believe in the Cursethan, maybe that's exactly what we saw." Sir Henry, who had been listening in silence, gave a small, dismissive snort. "I've seen plenty of clever tricks done with knives in music halls," he remarked. "And I've seen plenty of cases where people swear to one thing, and yet the facts tell an entirely different story." He turned towards Dr. Pender. "What about the possibility of a hidden assassin? A man concealed in the trees, skilled enough to throw a dagger with pinpoint accuracy." The room was still. The idea had merit. Sir Henry pressed on. "The second victim, Elliot Hayden, was convinced he was being watched. He sensed someone in the grove of trees. If a professional killer was hiding there, he could have struck down Richard Hayden first, then later attacked Elliot." He sat back, shaking his head slightly. "I admit, it's far-fetched, but at least it's plausible, more plausible than ghosts and pagan curses." Mr. Petherick, the quiet and analytical lawyer, cleared his throat. "But gentlemen, in all of these theories we are overlooking the most fundamental problem." He leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "What became of the weapon?" A hush fell over us. Petherick continued, his voice measured and firm. "If Miss Ashley had thrown a javelin or a dagger, how did she get rid of it? She was standing in the middle of an open space and nowhere to hide such a weapon." He paused. "And if a hidden murderer threw a dagger from the trees, where was the dagger when Richard Hayden was turned over? It wasn't in the wound." We exchanged glances, the weight of his words sinking in. "No," he went on, "we must discard these wild theories and focus on one undeniable fact. When Richard Hayden fell, No one was near him. That leaves only one possibility. The room seemed to grow colder. "Suicide," he said simply. There was a collective gasp. Raymond West scoffed, incredulous. "Suicide? But why on earth would he kill himself?" Petherick merely gave a thin, knowing smile. "That is a question of motive," he said. "And at the moment, I am not concerned with motives. I deal only with facts, and the facts suggest that he was the only one who could have wielded the weapon." His voice dropped lower, becoming almost hypnotic. "Imagine it. Richard Hayden, overcome by some unknown despair, takes the ancient dagger. Perhaps he is seized by some madness, some strange compulsion. He raises the weapon." He made a sharp motion with his hand, mimicking a thrust, and stabs himself. The silence in the room was absolute. As he falls, his arms jerk outward. The force of his collapse wrenches the dagger from the wound, sending it flying perhaps into the trees, perhaps into the undergrowth, lost forever. He sat back, his point made. Dr. Pender exhaled slowly. "It's a reasonable theory," he admitted, "and yet." He stared into the fire, his expression distant, troubled. "It does not explain the wind." A chill ran through me. "Nor does it explain the idol," he continued. "Elliot Hayden saw it change, grow, become something unnatural." He looked around at us, his voice quiet, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "Some things," he said, "are beyond logic." Joyce shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Sir Henry huffed, clearly unimpressed with supernatural explanations. Petherick, ever the rationalist, remained unmoved. Raymond West tapped his fingers against his knee, thoughtful but unconvinced. But too found myself staring at the window, at the trees beyond. The idol house of Astarte had stood for centuries, silent, watching. And somehow, deep in my bones, I knew the truth. It was not done with us yet. The idol house of Astarte. A heavy silence settled over the room, the weight of the mystery pressing upon them like an unseen force. Joyce Lempriere was the first to break it, her voice hesitant, almost unwilling to disturb the air thick with tension. "It's all so horrible, so uncanny. Have you no explanation, Dr. Pender?" The old clergyman nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as though peering into the past. "Yes," he said gravely, "I have an explanation of sorts, but even to this day certain aspects of the case trouble me deeply." Joyce shifted in her seat. "I've been to seances," she murmured. "Strange things happen. People laugh at them, but I swear, I've seen things that defy logic." Perhaps Diana Ashley did become the priestess of Astarte in that moment. Maybe she entered some kind of transom hypnotic state and threw the dagger without even realizing it. Raymond West, always the skeptic, scoffed. "Or perhaps the answer is far simpler," he suggested. "What if she wasn't holding a dagger at all, but something like a javelin? The moonlight could have distorted what Miss Mannering saw. If Diana did strike, maybe it was from a distance, almost like an ancient ritualistic sacrifice. And the rest of you, already expecting something supernatural, saw exactly what you feared." Sir Henry shook his head. "I've seen incredible feats with weapons in music halls, daggers thrown with unerring precision, arrows split in half midair. But even so, it would take an expert to strike like that. Could there have been someone hidden in the trees, a concealed hand that launched the weapon with deadly accuracy?" Dr. Pender frowned. "Perhaps, but if that were true, the weapon would still have been embedded in Richard Hayden's body when we turned him over. Instead, the dagger had vanished." Mr. Petherick, the lawyer, cleared his throat. "Let us step away from the fantastic and focus on what is logical. No one was near Sir Richard when he fell. That is an undeniable fact. Which leads to the only possible conclusion: he must have stabbed himself." "Suicide?" Raymond sounded incredulous. "But why?" "That is a matter of motive," Petherick admitted. "And at present, I am only concerned with facts. Suppose he did stab himself, perhaps in a moment of madness or as part of some elaborate deception. If he fell, his body's momentum could have wrenched the dagger from the wound, sending it flying into the trees. It's unlikely, but not impossible." Miss Marple, who had been listening with her usual quiet attentiveness, suddenly spoke. I don't like to say I am certain, but it does puzzle me very much. Curious things do happen. Why, at Lady Sharpley's garden party last year, the man arranging the clock golf tripped over one of the numbers and was quite unconscious for a full 5 minutes. Raymond chuckled, amused despite himself. Yes, dear aunt, but he wasn't stabbed, was he? Of course not, dear, Miss Marple said mildly. That's precisely what I mean. There is only one way Sir Richard could have been stabbed, but I do wonder what caused him to stumble in the first place. A tree root, perhaps. He was looking at Diana Ashley, was he not? And in moonlight, one can trip over the smallest thing. Dr. Pender regarded her keenly. You say there was only one way Sir Richard could have been stabbed, Miss Marple. She nodded thoughtfully. He was a right-handed man, wasn't he? To stab himself in the left shoulder, well, it's not impossible, but rather awkward. I always think of poor Jack Baines during the war. He shot himself in the foot at Arras, purely by accident, but he never forgave himself for it. And I don't expect Elliot Hayden profited much by his wicked crime either. Raymond leaned forward sharply. Elliot Hayden, you think he did it? Miss Marple blinked in mild surprise. But of course, who else could it have been? As Mr. Petherick so wisely pointed out, we must set aside the talk of heathen goddesses and look at the facts. Elliot was the first to reach his cousin's body. When he turned Richard over, his back was to all of you. And he was dressed as a brigand chief, was he not? A man in such a costume would naturally have a weapon in his belt. I remember dancing with a man dressed as a brigand chief when I was a young girl. He carried at least 5 different daggers and swords. It was most uncomfortable for his partner. All eyes turned to Dr. Pender. His expression was solemn. I knew the truth, he admitted quietly. 5 years after that night, I received a letter from Elliot Hayden himself. He confessed everything. A hush fell over the room. He suspected that I had always doubted him, Dr. Pender continued. In his letter, he admitted that it was a moment of sudden temptation. He had loved Diana Ashley as well, but unlike his cousin, he was a poor, struggling barrister. With Richard gone, he would inherit the title, the estates, and a future far beyond his reach otherwise. He never planned it, but when he knelt beside Richard's body, the dagger slipped from his own belt. And in that split second, he acted. Before he had even registered what he was doing, he drove the dagger into his cousin's back. Then he returned it to his belt, stood up, and played the part of the shocked witness. But his wound, Joyce breathed. That was a deliberate act as well, said Pender. Later that night, he stabbed himself to divert suspicion. He was careful, striking his shoulder and ensuring it was not fatal. He wanted to create a false narrative in where he too was a victim. Raymond exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And he got away with it. Not quite, Dr. Pender murmured. His crime profited him nothing. For 5 years, he wrote, I have lived in hell. I hope at least that I may expiate my crime by dying honorably. He was about to embark on an expedition to the South Pole. I do not believe he intended to return. A long silence followed. It was Sir Henry who finally spoke. He did die honorably, he said. I recognize the man you mean, Dr. Pender. His name may have been changed in your story, but history remembers him well. Dr. Pender nodded. And yet, even now, I do not believe that explanation fully accounts for all that happened that night. I still believe there was something else in that grove, something unseen, something dark. Even to this day, I never think of it without a shudder. He hesitated, then added in a whisper, The idol house of Astarte.